David Miller had built Atlas Manufacturing from nothing. What began as a humble startup in his garage 2 decades ago had grown into one of the most respected manufacturing companies across 3 states. With 12 large facilities and hundreds of employees under his leadership, David had long been praised as a visionary, a man who knew how to scale a business while honoring its people. But in recent months, something had shifted. Whispers of worker dissatisfaction had turned into formal complaints. Reports of low morale, outdated equipment, and even potential safety hazards had started trickling in. On-paper production numbers remained solid, but David couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was breaking beneath the surface. He had tried addressing the issues through management channels, but the answers he received always felt rehearsed, polished to perfection and empty of truth. So he made a bold decision. Instead of scheduling another executive meeting or launching a formal internal review, David decided to vanish, at least temporarily. He would go undercover. Not as a manager, not as a visiting executive, but as a temp worker. He would walk the floors, shoulder the load, and breathe the air his employees endured every single day. It was a move that startled his inner circle. "You're going to what his assistant had asked, blinking in disbelief. But David stood firm. He needed to see the real story, not the one edited for corporate reports, but the unfiltered version lived daily by the people who kept Atlas running. It was time to listen with his own ears and see with his own eyes. With the help of HR, David created a temporary worker profile under the alias Jake. A scruffy beard, reading glasses, worn-out jeans, and a faded hoodie helped complete the transformation. He chose the largest and most active factory in the network, located just outside of Chicago. It was a site he hadn't visited in years and where most employees wouldn't recognize his face. This anonymity would be his greatest tool. He informed HR to expect a new hire on Monday morning and boarded a red-eye flight that Sunday, both nervous and resolute. The factory loomed large as he arrived just before dawn. Trucks idled in the distance, loading docks buzzed with activity, and the air smelled faintly of oil and steel. Jake the worker clocked in like any other newcomer. There was no red carpet, no welcome committee, no morning briefing with coffee and slides, just a clipboard slapped into his hands by a wiry, disinterested man who muttered, "You the new guy? Great. Don't slow us down." David nodded quietly. "Sure thing," he replied, keeping his head low. That man was Travis, the floor manager. Stern rushed and already barking at someone else before David could even glance at the paper he'd been handed. Within minutes, David was placed in a packaging section alongside a team of seasoned workers. It didn't take long for him to realize just how far removed he'd become from the day-to-day reality of his business. The machines were deafening. The pace was relentless, and yet the people around him moved with practiced precision. One woman, Emily, offered him a quick smile and a few pointers, her hands taping and stacking boxes in a rhythm that looked more muscle memory than conscious thought. "Just keep up," she said with a tired voice. Carl's not big on patience. Carl David hadn't even heard that name yet. Another layer of management, it seemed one he'd have to watch closely. As the hours wore on, David's body ached in places he'd long forgotten. But more than the physical strain, what struck him was the emotional atmosphere. There was no sense of pride, no casual laughter or light conversation, just quiet endurance. People pushed through their shifts as if counting minutes, not accomplishments. No one seemed angry, just worn, disconnected, tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. And David understood with a sinking feeling in his gut that he was just scratching the surface. Whatever was broken here wasn't a fluke. It was systemic, it was cultural, and it was his responsibility to understand it fully before deciding how to fix it. The moment Jake David's undercover identity stepped onto the factory floor, it was like walking into a storm. The sheer volume hit him first. The roar of machines, the clatter of conveyor belts, and the constant hum of industrial fans created a wall of noise that made conversation nearly impossible. The air was thick with the scent of grease dust and something faintly metallic. Before he could take in his surroundings, a man with a furrowed brow and a clipboard approached him. "You're the new guy, right?" the man asked, without waiting for confirmation. "Name's Travis. Don't ask questions, don't get in the way, and don't screw up. That's it. No handshake, no introduction to safety procedures, just orders barked like commands in a war zone. With that, Travis shoved a worn sheet of instructions into Jake's hands and disappeared into the crowd of workers as quickly as he'd arrived. Thrown into the chaos, Jake found himself at a workstation surrounded by half-sealed boxes and stacks of packaging tape. He stood awkwardly for a moment until a young woman beside him looked up. "You knew?" she asked, her voice almost drowned out by the machines. "I'm Emily. Here, watch me and just follow along." She moved quickly, taping and folding with practiced efficiency. Despite her speed, she looked bone-tired, her eyes shadowed and her shoulders tense from days, maybe weeks of unbroken strain. Jake tried to keep up, fumbling at first, but slowly falling into rhythm beside her. "You'll be fine," she said, during a brief pause. "Just don't get on Travis's bad side. He's not exactly known for his patience." Jake watched as Travis paced through the rows, like a drill sergeant, clipboard always in hand, occasionally stopping only to shout at someone or scribble something down. Workers flinched when he passed by. Jake noticed that many of them barely spoke to one another. There was no music, no casual chatter, just focused eyes and stiff bodies pushing through hour after hour. It felt less like a team and more like a group of individuals stuck in the same machine-driven loop. Everyone moved fast, but no one looked fulfilled. The energy wasn't productive, it was survival-based. People were getting through their shifts, not contributing to something bigger. That difference, Jake realized, was everything. The machinery itself seemed as worn out as the people operating it. Jake watched conveyor belts jerk and sputter. At one point, the tape dispenser near his station jammed, and the worker next to him gave it a frustrated slap before fixing it with a pocket tool. There were no dedicated maintenance staff in sight. Instead, it appeared the workers were expected to repair their own stations on the fly. Jake asked Emily about it during a brief lull. "We report the issues," she said flatly, "but unless something catches fire, it doesn't get fixed. Old equipment, old problems." She offered a tired smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We make it work." Over time, Jake's body began to ache. His fingers stung from constant motion, and his lower back protested each time he bent down to stack another row of boxes. But what disturbed him more was the look he began to notice on everyone's faces. There was no joy, no pride, no ownership, just fatigue and detachment. He began to understand why the turnover rate in the factory was so high. This wasn't just hard labor. It was hard labor without hope. Jake caught sight of Travis leaning against a pillar near the end of the line, checking his phone while workers hustled past him. Every so often he'd yell at someone for slowing down, but he never lifted a finger to help. It was clear that leadership on this floor had checked out a long time ago. As the shift dragged on, Jake silently took inventory. He watched the way the older workers winced when lifting boxes. He noted the safety labels peeling off rusted machines, and he listened closely to the side comments, mutters about missed breaks, back-to-back shifts, and equipment that hadn't been replaced in years. This was more than just a bad day. It was a culture of neglect, patched together by fear and necessity, and somewhere along the way, Atlas. Manufacturing the company he had once built with integrity had let this environment take root. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow and returned to his task. He wasn't just here to observe anymore. He was here to fix what had been broken in plain sight. It was nearing the end of Jake's second day when the rhythm of the factory floor was suddenly broken. The hours had crawled by with the usual grind boxes, taped machines rumbling, and the ever-present tension of staying on pace. Jake had been assigned to a new station near the assembly lines, a corner of the factory, partially hidden behind tall stacks of finished goods. It was quieter there, but not by much. As he moved to retrieve a roll of packing material, he heard something unusual. Not the clang of machinery or barked orders, but a faint, trembling voice. It was low, barely audible over the ambient noise, but it sent a chill through him. "Please, I need help. I can't keep up." Jake froze. The voice was coming from behind a stack of crates. He hurried around them and found a man slumped against the metal frame, seated on the concrete floor. He looked to be in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with salt and pepper stubble and sweat soaking through his shirt. His face was pale, his eyes glassy with panic, and one hand gripped his chest tightly. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, crouching beside him. The man shook his head, his breath shallow and quick. "It's my chest," he whispered. "I told Travis. I asked for a break. He said, 'Finish the shift or don't come back.'" His voice cracked with pain and fear. Jake felt a sick twist in his stomach. Without hesitation, Jake stood and rushed through the maze of machines and crates looking for Travis. He found him leaning against a forklift, scrolling on his phone, without a care in the world. "Travis," Jake said, voice urgent. "One of the guys, he's in bad shape. He's sitting on the floor back near Station 4. He can't breathe." Travis didn't even glance up. "If it's Ray, he's always like that," he replied with a dismissive wave. "He's fine. Probably just wants to cut out early. Get back to your post." Jake's jaw tightened. "He's not fine. He's clutching his chest. He needs help." That finally earned a glance. Travis sighed dramatically, stuffing his phone into his pocket. "Fine. I'll call someone but you." He pointed a finger at Jake. "Get back to your station. We're already behind." Jake gave a tight nod and turned, but instead of heading to his workstation, he went right back to Ray. The man hadn't moved, still slumped, still fighting for breath. Jake stayed beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Help's coming. Just hang in there," he said quietly. Moments later, the on-site medic arrived with a wheeled stretcher. They asked a few quick questions, took Ray's vitals, and then carefully lifted him onto the gurney. As they wheeled him away, Ray gave Jake a weak but grateful look, an expression that etched itself into Jake's memory like a scar. Gratitude mixed with shame, like he was embarrassed for needing help. That look would haunt Jake long after the day ended. When the shift finally wrapped, Jake's hands were sore and his back ached, but his thoughts were miles away from the physical toll. He couldn't stop thinking about Ray, about the indifference in Travis's voice, about how easily the situation could have turned tragic if no one had stopped to care. Jake had come to the factory expecting hard work and maybe a few tough conditions, but this was neglect. This was cruelty dressed up as management. As he clocked out, he saw Emily walking past and gave her a silent nod. She smiled faintly. "Rough day?" she asked Jake, forced a small laugh. "Yeah, you could say that." But deep down, Jake knew something had shifted. This wasn't just a bad apple situation. It wasn't just about Travis's coldness or the factory's outdated machines. It was about a culture that had learned to look away. A place where asking for help made you weak, and where the only thing that seemed to matter was meeting numbers. Jake had seen enough to know that change wouldn't come from another policy memo or performance review. It had to come from the top. From someone who saw these people not as liabilities or line items, but as human beings. And for the first time since walking through those factory doors, Jake David Miller understood exactly what needed to be done. The next morning, Jake arrived at the factory even earlier than usual, his body still sore from the previous day's work. The sky was still dim, and the factory parking lot buzzed with the quiet shuffle of early arrivals. Inside, the same mechanical roar filled the air, and the same heavy atmosphere settled over the space like a fog. As he clocked in, Jake barely had time to hang up his jacket before Travis spotted him across the floor. "Jake!" he barked, motioning with his clipboard. "You're on assembly line 3 today. Numbers were garbage yesterday, so don't screw this up." There was no good morning, no briefing, just an order tossed his way like a bag of nails. Jake nodded his face, blank, but inside his pulse quickened. He'd heard whispers about Assembly Line 3. It was the factory's beast. Fast-paced, brutal, and the place where temp workers either proved themselves or burned out fast. He made his way across the factory floor, weaving through crates, forklifts, and workers already knee-deep in their tasks. Assembly Line 3 stretched along the far end of the warehouse, a series of belt-driven tables surrounded by workers who moved with robotic efficiency. Jake spotted Emily already there, Her sleeves rolled up her hands, flying as she handled parts and components with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "Welcome to the fun zone," she called out with a tired smile as Jake approached. He managed a grin in return. "Lucky me." She laughed softly, but her eyes were dim. "Just keep pace. Travis is in a mood. Production dipped last week, and he's gunning for someone to blame." Jake took his place beside a young man named Dylan, probably in his early 20s. The kid looked sharp but nervous, his fingers fumbling slightly as he kept up with the line's punishing speed. The machinery here moved faster, louder, and with less margin for error, Jake quickly realized that a single missed step could set off a chain reaction down the entire line. And then it happened. Dylan reached for a component, his hand slipping slightly, and the part hit the floor with a dull thud. It was nothing, a 2-second delay at most, but it was enough to bring the storm. Travis descended like a hawk. "Dylan." "What the hell are you doing?" he roared, stomping across the floor. "You think this is recess? Pick it up. We don't have time for screw-ups." Dylan's face turned bright red. He muttered an apology, eyes downcast as he scrambled to recover. Travis didn't care. He stood over the young man, berating him for another 30 seconds before storming off, leaving a trail of silence in his wake. Jake clenched his fists. Every fiber of his being wanted to speak out, to step between them, to remind Travis that people aren't machines. But he held back for now. He was still undercover, and the truth of this place was still unfolding. Instead, he looked at Dylan, who was now trembling slightly as he rushed to catch up. Jake leaned in and whispered, "You're doing fine, man. Just breathe." Dylan gave a quick, grateful nod, but said nothing. Around them, no one else reacted. The entire line kept moving, heads down, mouths shut. It was as if this kind of outburst had become routine, something to expect to endure and eventually to accept. And that, Jake realized, was perhaps the worst part. As the hours dragged on, the emotional weight of the environment pressed harder than the physical labor. Jake watched the way workers flinched at loud noises or sudden movements. He noticed how everyone kept one eye on Travis, as if bracing for impact. Breaks were shorter than scheduled. Barely enough time to sit, let alone rest. Even when people had a minute to breathe, they didn't talk much. They just stared at the floor, sipped lukewarm coffee, and waited to be told when to get back up. It was survival, plain and simple. This wasn't a workplace, it was a pressure cooker, a place where people didn't dare hope for better because they'd been trained not to expect it. By the end of the shift, Jake's arms felt like lead and his mind was spinning. But more than the physical fatigue, it was the silence that haunted him. The collective hush of a workforce ground down by fear, treated like cogs in a machine they didn't own and couldn't escape. Travis, clipboard in hand, did one last sweep of the floor before retreating to his office. Jake watched him go, the door slamming shut behind him like a final insult. Then he looked around at the people still packing up, still moving quietly, still pretending that everything was fine. Jake knew better. He had seen the cracks. He had felt the weight. And now he understood with absolute clarity the damage here wasn't just in the machines, it was in the people, and it was long past time for someone to care. Lunchtime arrived, not with the chime of a bell or the warmth of anticipation, but with the bark of Travis shouting, 15 minutes. People, move it. The break room was tucked in the back corner of the factory, barely more than a box with folding tables and vending machines humming louder than the conversations inside. Jake walked in with a paper tray of lukewarm food, scanning the room until he spotted Emily seated alone at the far end. Her posture was slouched, one hand propping up her head, while the other idly pushed her sandwich around the plate. He hesitated for a second before crossing the room and sliding into the seat across from her. She didn't look up right away, but when she did, she managed a faint smile. "Hey, Jake! Survived another morning." Jake chuckled under his breath and nodded. "Barely. That assembly line is brutal." Emily let out a tired laugh and reached for her drink. "You get used to it, or maybe you just stop noticing how hard it is." There was a pause filled only by the buzz of the vending machine and the distant thrum of machines still working outside the walls. Jake leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You've been here a while, right?" She nodded. "Yeah, 4 years. Longer than most temps, I guess." I stuck. Jake's tone softened. "Mind if I ask why? This place? It's not exactly easy." Emily looked down at her tray, her jaw tightening slightly. "My son, he starts school next month. I need the paycheck, the insurance, stability, even if it's like this." There was a quiet strength in her voice, but also a weariness that came from years of holding things together without help. Jake studied her for a moment, noting how young she really was. Early 30s, maybe younger, yet carrying herself like someone decades older. "It shouldn't be this hard," he said. "Especially not when people are working this hard." Emily gave a half shrug. "Tell that to Travis, or better yet, try telling it to corporate." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Has anyone ever tried?" She gave a bitter laugh, not unkind, just tired. "Oh, people have complained once or twice, didn't go anywhere. Travis has been here forever. They love him upstairs because his numbers always look good. Doesn't matter how many people quit as long as quotas are met. He's golden." Jake leaned back, letting that sink in. So that was it. Travis wasn't just a bad manager. He was a protected one, and the system, whether by choice or neglect, had allowed it. "So what happens when someone speaks up?" he asked quietly. Emily's eyes flicked around the room, then returned to him. "Best case, you get labeled a troublemaker. Worst case, you're gone. They don't fire you outright. They just stop giving you hours, or move you to a worse shift, or suddenly your name isn't on the schedule. It's subtle, but you feel it." She paused. "That's why people stay quiet. We all have bills, kids, sick parents. No one wants to risk it." Jake felt a deep pang in his chest, not just guilt, but shame. He had sat in meetings where glowing reports from floor managers painted a picture of smooth operations. He'd seen the data, the retention rates, the production graphs. But he'd never seen this. Never seen the fear etched into tired faces, the unspoken rules that kept people compliant. He looked back at Emily, who was now quietly finishing her lunch. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She gave a tired sigh. "Every day. But then I think about my boy, and I remind myself, it's just a job. I'll do what I have to do to get him through school. That's all that matters." Before Jake could respond, the break room door swung open with a bang. Travis stood in the doorway, his voice booming. "Lunch is over in 5. Let's go." The room shifted instantly. People rose from their seats, trays discarded half-full conversations, silenced mid-sentence. Emily stood up slowly, brushing crumbs off her pants and tossing her tray. As she passed Jake, she offered a small smile. "Thanks for sitting with me," she said softly. "Most people don't." Jake nodded, his voice quiet. "You shouldn't have to do this alone." But she was already walking away, shoulders squared for another round of survival. Jake remained seated a moment longer, staring at the uneaten half of his meal and feeling the weight of what he now carried, not just what he'd heard, but what he knew could no longer be ignored. By mid-afternoon, the temperature inside the factory seemed to rise along with the tension. The air was thick with dust and sweat, and Jake's shirt clung to his back like a second skin. He had just finished unloading a shipment of raw materials when Travis approached, his voice as grating as ever. "Maintenance crew's behind," he said, tossing a pair of stained gloves at Jake. "You're helping Chuck with the press machine. Try not to break anything. No instructions, no questions about his qualifications." Just another order barked into the void. Jake, masking his irritation, nodded and made his way toward the far end of the floor, where he spotted a stocky man crouched beside a massive industrial press. Chuck, mid-50s, grizzled sweat running down his neck, looked up with tired eyes. "They send you to babysit me?" he asked with a dry laugh. "Guess we better make it quick. This beast's been jamming all day." Jake joined him watching as Chuck pried open the access panel on the side of the machine. Inside, years of grime and metal shavings coated the gears. "We've been begging for a replacement," Chuck muttered, reaching in with a long rod to dislodge a stuck component. "But Travis says it's cheaper to keep it limping." Jake frowned instinctively, keeping a hand near the emergency stop button. The press machine was ancient, clearly older than some of the workers, and the warnings etched into its faded control panel were barely legible. Chuck worked quickly, maneuvering around the exposed gears with practiced caution. But suddenly the machine shuddered, and in a flash of motion, Chuck let out a sharp yell. "Damn it!" His arm jerked violently as his hand was caught between two grinding metal teeth. Jake didn't hesitate. He slammed the emergency stop with his fist, the shriek of grinding steel replaced by an eerie silence. The machine hissed, gears slowing to a crawl as Jake rushed to Chuck's side. "Let me see," he said, voice tight with panic. Chuck winced, clutching his wrist, blood already soaking through his glove. "It's not bad." Chuck grunted, trying to stand. "I've had worse." But Jake could see the way his face had gone pale, how he swayed slightly as he stood. This wasn't nothing. It was another injury in a workplace already bursting with hazards. Another incident swept under the rug in favor of speed over safety. "Come on," Jake said firmly, grabbing his arm gently. "We're going to the infirmary." Travis appeared as they stepped away from the machine, his expression already annoyed. "What? Now?" he groaned. Crossing his arms, Jake didn't slow down. "Chuck's hurt. His hand got caught in the gears. He needs to be checked out now." Travis glanced at the blood but didn't flinch. "It's just a scratch," he muttered. "We don't have time to baby everyone every time they bump their elbow." Jake stopped and turned toward him, his voice sharper than it had been since arriving. He was almost pulled into a failing machine. "That's not a scratch, that's a safety failure." For a brief second, the floor around them seemed to pause. Nearby workers slowed their tasks, ears perked. Travis scowled but waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, take him. But don't come crying to me when production falls behind." Together, Jake and Chuck made it to the infirmary, a small room tucked behind the offices, with a tired nurse and a cot that had seen better days. The nurse cleaned and wrapped Chuck's wound while muttering about the lack of supplies and how often she saw injuries like this. Jake stayed quiet, watching Chuck grit his teeth as antiseptic stung the gash. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was deep and, more importantly, preventable. When they left the infirmary, Chuck offered a quiet thanks. His pride clearly stung more than his hand. Jake nodded. "You shouldn't have to thank someone for caring." Chuck gave him a long look, then nodded slowly. "You're not like the others," he said. Jake didn't answer. Back on the floor, the factory resumed its rhythm, but something had shifted. Workers had seen the confrontation, the injury, the refusal to back down. And while no one spoke of it, Jake sensed a quiet ripple of awareness moving through the crew, the kind of awareness that maybe not definitely, but maybe things could be different. He looked around at the rusted rails, the overworked faces, the supervisors who turned a blind eye, and he felt the urgency deepen inside him. This wasn't just about one broken machine or one injured hand. This was about a system that punished silence and rewarded neglect Jake had come to observe, but now he was carrying responsibility, a moral weight that he couldn't ignore, and with each passing day it was becoming clearer. Something had to change soon. The day wore on and Jake's legs felt heavier with every step. The machines buzzed. The air was stale and the same exhausted eyes met his across the floor. Every minute spent here peeled away another layer of illusion he had once believed about how his company operated. He had once told investors that Atlas Manufacturing was a place where hard work was valued, where people mattered. But after just a few days in the belly of this factory, he could see now how far from that truth they'd drifted. It wasn't just the outdated equipment or the suffocating pace. It was the silence, the compliance, the resignation. It was in the way people moved like ghosts through a place that never seemed to stop grinding them down. But amid all the fatigue and routine, Jake found himself drawn to the youngest face on the line. Dylan had caught Jake's attention the day before when Travis berated him publicly for a minor mistake. Today, as the shift transitioned to unloading supplies from a late delivery, Jake ended up working shoulder to shoulder with the young man. They lifted boxes together in relative quiet until Jake finally broke the silence. "Tough couple of days," he said. Setting a box down on a pallet, Dylan gave a short laugh. Dry, tired. "Yeah, that's one way to put it." Jake studied him for a moment before asking gently, "What brought you here?" "If you don't mind me asking." Dylan paused, leaning against the side of the truck. "My mum got sick last year," he said quietly. "Hospital bills, treatments, all piled up fast. College wasn't an option anymore. I needed to work. This place was hiring. It was supposed to be temporary. But here I am." Jake nodded slowly. The kid couldn't have been older than 22, yet he was carrying the kind of weight that would break most grown men. "You thinking of staying long-term?" Jake asked. Dylan shrugged. "I don't know. Some days I want to walk out. But my mum, she needs me. This place is brutal, but it's steady. I can't afford to risk it." His voice cracked slightly, and he looked away, embarrassed. "Besides, not like anyone up top cares what we go through down here." Jake felt that line like a punch to the chest. The worst part was, Dylan was right. For too long, people like him had been invisible to the people making the decisions, as if to underscore the point. Jake overheard a conversation just a few yards away. Travis was talking to another supervisor near the loading dock, unaware that Jake was within earshot. "Temps," Travis scoffed, shaking his head. "They're a dime a dozen. Drop one another shows up tomorrow. They should be grateful we even give them a shot." The other supervisor chuckled. "Yeah, they're easy to replace. No loyalty anyway." Jake felt his jaw clench. He looked over at Dylan, who hadn't heard the exchange, but Jake suddenly understood why the younger man's shoulders seemed permanently hunched, why his eyes darted every time Travis walked by. It wasn't just pressure. It was the knowledge that he was seen as disposable. Jake helped Dylan finish the last of the unloading in silence, his thoughts boiling just beneath the surface. How many others were here for similar reasons, supporting parents, kids themselves, doing everything they could just to hold their lives together, while the people at the top stayed blind to the weight they were carrying. This wasn't just a management problem. It was a cultural rot, a system built on the assumption that if one body failed, another would show up to take its place. The idea that workers could be treated like interchangeable parts was deeply embedded in how this factory, and maybe the company as a whole, had been run. When their shift ended, Jake clapped Dylan gently on the shoulder. "Hang in there," he said. Dylan looked surprised, but managed a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Jake. Not many people say that around here." Jake forced a smile in return, but inside his guilt was mounting. He had been one of the people who didn't say it. For years he'd believed the reports, the statistics, the charts, showing everything was fine. He had been proud of those numbers, proud of the expansion, the efficiency, but those numbers had faces, stories, struggles. People like Dylan, whose worth could never be measured by a line on a spreadsheet. As the factory lights dimmed and the floor began to clear, Jake stayed back for a moment, watching the last of the workers file out. Travis had already retreated to his office clipboard under one arm, as detached as ever. But Jake was done pretending. These people deserved more. More than thankless shifts, more than broken machines, more than empty promises from a CEO they'd never met. He turned toward the exit, a single thought echoing louder than any machine in the factory. They're not disposable, and it's time someone started proving. That the next morning the factory hummed with its usual rhythm, early footsteps echoing off concrete forklifts, rolling into place, and workers clocking in with blank expressions. But something was different. Just outside the building, a sleek black car pulled into the employee lot. Out stepped David Miller. Not Jake the temp, not the man in worn-out boots and a hoodie, but the CEO of Atlas Manufacturing in a pressed navy blue suit and polished shoes. He walked toward the building with a quiet confidence, the weight of the past week etched into his features. The receptionist looked up, startled. Good morning, David said calmly, adjusting his tie. I'm David Miller. I need to speak with Travis. Now. Word travelled fast. Within minutes, Travis appeared near the break room, his usual scowl already in place. Mr. Miller, he stammered clearly, thrown off by the surprise visit. What? What brings you here today? His eyes darted towards the factory floor. Confused, David met his gaze with a calm, even expression. Let's talk privately, he said. Without waiting for an answer, he motioned toward an empty office at the back. Inside, the door closed behind them with a firm click. The silence that followed was brief. David folded his arms. I've been working undercover on this floor for the past few days. I've seen the way you treat these workers, the conditions you've let continue, and your blatant disregard for safety, dignity, and decency. Travis opened his mouth to respond, but David didn't let him. You don't get to explain. I saw you ignore a man having chest pain. I saw you laugh about replacing temps like they're nothing. I saw you mock injuries and push people past the edge of exhaustion. That's not leadership, it's negligence. It ends now. Travis turned red, stumbling over his words, but the numbers mean nothing. David cut in, his voice rising for the first time. Not when people are getting hurt, not when they're afraid to speak up. Effective immediately, you're fired. Security will escort you out. Don't come back. He opened the door, and the hallway beyond fell quiet as two company security officers stepped in. Travis looked stunned, but David didn't flinch. It was over. David stepped out of the office and walked toward the center of the factory floor. Conversations fell silent. Heads turned. Machines slowed. Workers began to gather, confusion spreading across their faces. He stood tall, cleared his throat, and raised his voice, not in anger, but with calm authority. Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Miller, CEO of Atlas Manufacturing. I've been here among you this past week under the name Jake, and I've seen the truth for myself. A stunned hush fell across the room. I've seen the unsafe machines, the ignored injuries, the lack of support, and the disrespect. And I want you to know, this change starts now, he continued, voice steady, eyes locking with those of the workers he had come to know. Emily Dillon Chuck. Effective today, we are replacing every outdated machine in this factory. A full maintenance team is being brought in, and safety will no longer be a checkbox, it will be a priority. You will have proper breaks, 2 15-minute rests, and a 30-minute lunch that will be honored, not rushed. No more skipped meals, no more intimidation, no more being treated like you don't matter. There was still silence, but something began to shift in the crowd, an energy, a flicker of belief. Jake, no, David wasn't just talking. He was taking action. He turned to a few familiar faces in the front of the crowd. Emily Dillon Chuck, you've shown courage, resilience, and loyalty in a system that hasn't always deserved it. I'll be meeting with each of you personally this week to discuss promotions, compensation, and how we move forward together. For the first time, smiles appeared, not wide or loud, but real. Emily covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. Dillon blinked hard, shoulders straightening for the first time. Chuck gave a slow, proud nod. Around them, workers exchanged glances, hope replacing doubt, surprise melting into cautious trust. David looked around the room, letting the silence linger. Then he said, "The most important thing of all. From this point forward, you will be heard, you will be seen, you will be respected, because this company is not made of machines or production goals, it's made of people, and I will never forget that again." As applause slowly broke out, tentative at first, then stronger, David felt something inside him shift, not pride, not relief, something deeper, purpose. Because real leadership, he now understood, wasn't built in corner offices or boardrooms. It was forged right here on the ground in the sweat and stories of the people who made everything possible. Later that afternoon, after the shock of the announcement began to settle, David gathered a smaller group of employees near the break room, a space that hours earlier had been a symbol of exhaustion and silence. Now buzzing with cautious conversation, Emily stood near the doorway, still stunned by everything she'd heard. Her hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white as if she expected the floor to drop out from under her at any moment. David approached with a warm smile, carrying a manila folder in hand. "Emily," he said gently, "you've been the backbone of this floor for years. You train new hires, hold the line together, and still find time to lift others when they're falling apart. Starting today, you're being promoted to shift supervisor. Along with that, you'll receive a pay raise and full benefits." Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out, only a soft gasp, and then tears. Emily blinked rapidly, trying to keep composure as her co-workers turned toward her in surprise. "Are you serious?" she whispered. David nodded. "Completely. You've earned every bit of it." Slowly, she reached out and shook his hand, her voice trembling. "Thank you." "I don't know what to say." David smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just keep doing what you've always done, leading by example." Around them, the atmosphere shifted. Applause started softly, then spread through the group like wildfire. Emily wiped her eyes with her sleeve, laughter mixing with disbelief. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was seen. Dylan stood nearby, awkwardly clapping with the others, trying to keep his emotions at bay. He had never asked for much, just a steady job enough to help his mother and maybe a little dignity. David turned toward him next. "Dylan," he said, "your story moved me. You put your life on hold to take care of someone you love, and you've done it while working tirelessly in a place that didn't always treat you with respect. Starting today, Atlas Manufacturing will cover the remaining balance of your mother's medical expenses through our employee support fund." Dylan froze. His clipboard fell from his hands with a soft thud. His eyes widened, glossed with tears. He tried to blink away. Are you serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. 100%. You deserve peace of mind, and your mum deserves care without it, costing you your future." Dylan stepped forward, hands shaking. He tried to speak, but couldn't. Instead, he reached out and hugged David tightly, an unplanned, unfiltered expression of gratitude. The room around them had gone quiet, everyone watching as a moment of real humanity unfolded between a young man who'd been forgotten and a leader who'd finally remembered what mattered. "Thank you," Dylan managed at last. "Thank you so much." David patted his back. "Just take care of your family." "Dylan, we'll take care of the rest." Then came Chuck. The older maintenance worker stood near the edge of the group, arms folded, bandage still visible under his sleeve. He looked skeptical. Even guarded years of disappointment had hardened his expectations, but David hadn't forgotten him either. "Chuck," he said, "you've kept this factory running longer than most of our machines. Even when no one was listening, you still showed up, still patched things together, still helped the people around you. I'm giving you 2 weeks of fully paid medical leave to recover, no questions asked, and a bonus to thank you for your years of service." Chuck's expression shifted from stoic to stunned. His lips parted, but for a moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice rough with emotion, he replied, I never expected this." "Not in a million years." David stepped forward and shook his hand. "You earned it. You've earned more than this company has given you. But that changes now." Chuck nodded slowly, his eyes watering. Despite the tough exterior, a few workers clapped, others patted him on the back. He looked down, embarrassed by the attention, but clearly moved. As the group began to disperse, David took one last look around the room. It was still the same break room, the same walls, the same vending machines, but the air had changed. People weren't just walking away, they were standing taller, smiling, talking again. This wasn't just about recognition, it was about restoration. And for the first time in far too long, the factory felt alive with something other than noise and pressure. It felt alive with hope. The next morning, the factory buzzed with a different kind of energy. Word had spread about the changes, the promotions and the firings. Conversations were no longer whispered with fear, but spoken aloud with cautious optimism. For the first time in a long time, people looked each other in the eye as they clocked in. hopeful that maybe, just maybe, the tide was finally turning. David arrived just after sunrise this time, not as Jake the temp, not as David the CEO in a suit, but simply as a man ready to keep his promise. He wore a clean button-down and jeans, no security detail, no clipboard, just purpose. He stepped onto the floor and called everyone to gather, his voice firm but inviting. Once the workers had assembled, David took a breath and looked around the room. Familiar faces, Emily, Dylan, Chuck, and dozens more watched him closely, waiting. "I want to thank you," he began. "Not just for showing up today, but for everything you've endured while we weren't paying attention." He paused, letting the words settle. "This company was built on hard work, sacrifice, and people like you. But somewhere along the way, I stopped listening. I trusted reports and managers instead of hearing from the people who make this place run. That was my mistake, and I won't let it happen again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small laminated card. "Starting next week," he continued, "we're launching a direct employee feedback system available both digitally and here on site. Every worker will have the opportunity to submit concerns, ideas, and questions, and those messages. They'll go directly to me, not filtered, not edited, not delayed, straight to my desk." A few workers exchanged surprised glances. David nodded, sensing their hesitation. "It won't be perfect at first, but it will be real. Because real leadership doesn't happen behind boardroom doors. It happens here on the floor, in conversations, in listening before acting." He turned, slightly gesturing toward the old office where Travis once held court. That office. It's no longer reserved for someone who leads through fear. It's being converted into a transparency hub, a space where supervisors rotate weekly to meet with teams, discuss goals, and share updates openly. No more hidden decisions, no more silence. Leadership from now on will be about showing up and staying accountable. And if I ever lose touch again, I want you to call me out. Loudly, his tone was serious, but his expression carried something new. Humility. Emily raised her hand and spoke softly but clearly. "Why now? Why us?" David smiled gently. "Because I remembered something. When I started this company, I worked with my hands. I knew every name, every shift, every line. But as Atlas grew, I got further away from all of that. I convinced myself that numbers told the whole story, but it was your stories that finally woke me up." He looked toward Dylan, then Chuck. "You reminded me what leadership really is. Not control, not fear, but trust. And I promise to earn that trust back one day at a time." The room stood in quiet stillness for a moment, not because they were unsure of what to say, but because they were seeing something they hadn't witnessed in years, a leader who wasn't standing above them, but beside them. As the crowd began to nod and slowly applaud, David felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just managing a company anymore, he was leading people, people with voices, families, dreams, and pride. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the CEO of Atlas Manufacturing. He felt like its guardian, its advocate, its student. And in that moment, under the flickering lights of a factory once defined by silence, a new kind of leadership was born, not in policy, but in promise. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to be reminded that leadership is about listening, not titles, and that change begins when we choose courage over comfort. At Deep Inside HQ, we believe every worker has a voice and every story has the power to create impact. Subscribe for more real-life inspired stories that challenge the status quo, expose hidden truths, and reignite hope where it's been lost. Let's build a world where dignity and empathy lead the way together.